Well, good morning everybody. Let's start. My name is Dirk Berg-Schlosser. I teach political science at the University of Marburg in Germany, and as some of the others here, I took part in a conference yesterday which was organized by Professor Melville, demonstrating this new big research project here concerning a political atlas of the world. The title of my talk today is Quality of Democracy in Post-Communist States. And I'll immediately have to make a certain qualification. Talking about post-communist states, I use this as, for a lack of a better term. What is included here are altogether 27 countries from Eastern and Central Europe and the CIS states, including the Russian Federation. So, well, these countries have some common history, some common cultural traditions, so it does make sense to some extent to group them together under certain regional considerations. And the second important qualification is put here in brackets, as measured by current indicators of democracy and quote-unquote good governance. And as you will see in a moment, all these indicators have some strengths, but also some weaknesses. And I will tell this a little bit more in detail. And in fact, my talk takes off where Martin Brusis left. He talked more about the conceptual and methodological side of such indicators and measures. And I'll show you some more practical applications in a way. And the idea was that, there is, I think, as he mentioned the term, some convergent validity among those indicators. Even each one of them has its limitations, and so I think we do not always have to invent the wheel again. We can make use of some of the information contained in such indicators and combine them in certain ways to arrive at already at least some meaningful insights and possible conclusions. Please feel free to ask questions anytime, and I may also ask one or the other question. It should be more of a kind of an interactive thing, so please feel free to ask me anytime you want. As was already mentioned also by Martin Brusis, the context is the last so-called wave of democratization after the events of 1989-1990, most dramatically in this border region, but also with repercussions in other parts of the world, in to some extent Latin America, but also quite strongly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and some other parts. What can be shown, in spite of, some common history, some common cultural other characteristics, there are significant differences between Central and Eastern European states and CIS states, and also between the kinds of types of political systems which are now in existence and their kind of performance over time, and with regard to, for example, good governance, but also with regard to some other performance-related indicators such as Human Development Index. So, first of all, how can we classify the presently existing political systems? What is the present situation? What are possible explanations for this? This we can take up in the discussion afterwards again. And which further developments may be expected. So these are the kind of leading questions. And the first step is to identify the kind of political systems we have at present in these different countries. And there are very different measures or indicators to identify or to qualify their democraticness or the absence of democraticness. And here again, I also start, as Martin mentioned, from Dahl's concept of polyarchy, which basically has two explicit dimensions, namely the level of popular participation and the level of contestation or open pluralist competitiveness. But in Dahls concept there always is at least implicit a third dimension, which is a normative dimension, namely referring to the existence, at least again, of a certain minimum level of civil liberties. You cannot have open pluralist competition without freedom of speech, without freedom of information, and even the rule of law, even though usually it's kept as a separate dimension, is, I think, a necessary part of a broader concept of democracy. But we'll see in a moment how these different concepts or different dimensions are measured by different authors, and some were already mentioned before, like Tato van Hanen, Ted Gurr and his associates, the so-called polity scores or polity index. Now the latest one is polity 4, dating from 2004, I believe. Freedom House annually publishes their ratings on political rights and civil liberties. I added here another measure indicating, well, at least what is meant here, gross human rights violations. These are compiled by an organization in the Netherlands, showing what about, well, torture or political detainees, or detainees for political reasons without trial, things like that. Then the World Bank indicators of good governance were already mentioned. And I want to show briefly what their respective strengths and weaknesses are, but also how they can be combined for certain purposes into, here in a very simple way, into 3 major types, what may be called liberal democracies on the one hand, then some kind of intermediary, defective or whatever democracies, which can be called electoral democracies or facade democracies, and then clearly authoritarian systems. And if you look at table 1, you find these various indicators. The first one by van Hanen, and here he has a scale of, theoretically between 0 and 100, and has a threshold of 10 on this scale, and all countries scoring higher than 10 can be classified as democracies in van Hanen's sense. And as was also mentioned before, van Hanen takes, the 2 key components of Dahl, participation in terms of electoral turnout, voting participation, and contestation, competition in terms of the size of the largest party in parliament, which is deducted from 100. And then he multiplies these 2 indicators and comes up with this score. Just to give you a current example, Sunday's election, you had roughly 60%, as far as I can tell, voting turnout. Now you have roughly 70% of this parliamentary seats by the biggest party, so you would deduct 70 from 100 and you get 30. Then you multiply 60% turnout, 30% of the party representation in parliament, you come up with a value of 18. And 18 for van Hanen would show that Russia clearly is a democracy. So it's as simple as that. But if you look at today's paper, I saw some regional figures, and it appeared that, for example, in Chechnya, you had 99.5% election turnout, and from this perspective, Chechnya seems to be the most democratic part of this country. But at the same time, apparently, you had a similarly high figure of 98 or 99% voting for United Russia. And so probably, I don't know the exact figures, there will not be a single member of parliament from Chechnya from another party. So van Hanen would take these 2 figures, and on the one hand you have almost 100% turnout, but then he would multiply it with deducting the size of the largest party as they are represented in parliament, and then he would arrive at 0. And 100 multiplied by 0 still means 0 democracy, at least as far as Chechnya is concerned. So you see how this concept works. But what von Hahn cannot do, and this is a severe limitation, he cannot tell from his data, as they are published by the usual statistical offices or electoral commissions, whether the elections actually have been free and fair, whether at least some national and international observers were satisfied with procedures being followed or not. And so in this respect we have an important limitation. And if you look at, well, what von Hahn gives as a result for all these 27 countries, if you see which ones are below his 10 threshold, you have only very few which are below there. And altogether he would arrive at 21 democracies in this entire region. With Göre and Freedom House, it's a different procedure. Yes, please.
May I have one question?
Sure.
Posed to von Hahn. Do you get the calculations right that if there were, let's say, 1 or 2 opposition deputies in the Chechen parliament multiplied by 100, so it would mean 10 or 20 points, so it would be democracy?
Well, you multiply the two figures. For all of Russia, 30 by 60 means 1800, and then you divide it by 100 to get this scale between 0 and 100. You know? And if you have 2 deputies for Chechnya and 100% participation, you have 200 divided by 100 and you have 2, which would mean also no democracy. Okay? Well, Göre and Freedom House, well, he uses objective, quote-unquote, data. Göre and Freedom House use subjective data, which are arrived at by using coders. And again, you have to be careful about such codings because a lot of bias can influence your codings, and it must be said in the beginning, for example, for Freedom House, it was a single person, Raymond Gastill, who, by reading the New York Times, as one colleague said, was drawing some numbers from his head, and then he assigned scores to all of the countries in the world. And there you have a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being the best value and 7 being the worst. And you have a threshold of all countries lower than 2.5 are democracies or are called free countries, and those above 2.5 then can be graded on an ordinal scale in a different way. So Freedom House, since the early 90s, has improved this procedure. They now use a broader basis of information, media, and they also use, try to test intercoder reliability, things like that. But nevertheless, until last year, they have now elaborate checklists how to arrive at such scores, but nevertheless, until last year, it was not made transparent what the individual coders assigned as scores and how these scores were aggregated. And now they try to be more transparent in order to cope with some of the criticism which has been raised by political scientists and by many others, because, and this is important to note, such scores are not just academic exercises. Freedom House scores are used by the World Bank for assigning loans in terms of good governance or not, or for the Millennium, not the Millennium Development Goals, but for the Millennium Development Account, MDA, by the United States. The Freedom House scores and the World Bank scores are two sources of information they use to classify countries which are entitled to receive aid and the others are not. So it's also politically relevant what is behind such indicators, but as you see, there are some weaknesses or dubious elements, and the same is with the Göre scale. Their scale is based, reaching from 0 to 10, and having 8 as a threshold value. If it's above 8, it's a democracy. It's below 8, it's something else. And also based on, coding. In the beginning, done by his wife Erika for a long time, and only more lately based on a broader, more transparent way of coding. And they use constitutions and legal documents as their source of information, also going back to the early 19th century in Europe and other places of the world, where you do have constitutional government. And so these are different sources of information, different ways of trading them, and, well, different strengths and weaknesses in the kind of information these indicators provide. Then, well, here is the Gross Human Rights Violation Index, ranging from 1 to 5, 1 being the best value, 5 the worst. And there you have some countries like Hungary, where there are no gross human rights violations, but in former Yugoslavia, it's still fairly high, or in places like here, Kazakhstan and others. So this is an additional information on human rights situations, which are also part of a normative definition of democracy. And then you have here two World Bank dimensions. One is called voice and accountability, which is like an indicator of democracy, arrived in the way which was described by Martin Bruses. They do not have their own primary data. They do not have annual investigations across the world collecting data, but they use existing sources and combine them in a certain way with this unobserved components analysis, and have this extraction, so to speak, of what remains as a commonly shared ground in such dimensions. And here, on the one hand, the voice and accountability dimension, and on the other hand, the rule of law dimension, which I also think is a necessary component of any democratic system. But not exclusively so. You may have states like Singapore where the rule of law is maintained, but which are not democratic. So it's a kind of an overlapping category. And their scales range from -2.5 to +2.5, and you can consider the zero value as a kind of threshold. And just to illustrate and simplify this, if you take a country like the Czech Republic, it's clearly by Van Hanen score, it's a democracy. The same is true for GER, for Freedom House, no gross human rights violations. There is a fairly high value for the rule of law, for voice and accountability, and you can classify the Czech Republic, where all the indicators are in agreement, that all of them classify the Czech Republic as a democracy. It seems to be justified to do this. And conversely, at the other extreme, if you have a case like Turkmenistan, even for Van Hanen, it's very low. For GER, it's 0, Freedom House 7. There are gross human rights violations, and the rule of law and the voice and accountability also are very low. And this can be clearly classified as for also, again, lack of a better term, an authoritarian system of some kind. But there are important cases in between where these different indicators do not agree amongst each other. And you may take Russia as a case. Well, these are the data for, I believe, 2004, before the most recent election. But even with the recent election, Van Hanen would classify Russia as clearly a democracy. For GER, it's below the threshold, not very much, but nevertheless. Freedom House, it's clearly above their threshold and does not qualify. Gross human rights violations are also existing, at least in parts of the country, according to this score, and the rule of law and the voice and accountability are also not fully established. And so it's a kind of an intermediate case. And I classified the intermediate cases here just by a 2 between the 1 and the 3. And then you have, in this simple way, different types of political system, which are distinguished by qualitative criteria. It's not a continuous scale, but it's a trichotomized scale, distinguishing different types. And for this intermediate type, you can have different adjectives: electoral democracy, defective democracy, facade democracy, things like that. But what is even, well, first of all, it's important that these indicators can be used, at least the source of information which is contained in them can be extracted in a certain way. And secondly, it can be used using this typology to see what the performance of these different types actually is. And if we, well, for example, assess the performance by using some other World Bank dimensions, in addition to the two which already were mentioned, rule of law and voice and accountability, you can use the further dimensions of government effectiveness, which refers to the quality of the bureaucracy and the public services. Second dimension, what they call the regulatory burden, which refers to quote unquote market unfriendly policies, a lot of cumbersome bureaucratic procedures to start a business, price regulations, foreign trade regulations, things like that. And thirdly, the control of corruption, which means whether a public power is used for private gains or not. And if you look at these three dimensions and then look at how these different countries fare on these dimensions and which are the different scores of the different system types, you can come up with a more complete table. And here, in addition, I used to the control of corruption dimension as a further illustration the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, but which in fact is also part of the information which goes into the World Bank dimension of control of corruption. And if you use these indicators, you can see again across the same cases, and let's take the same examples again. The Czech Republic, being democratic, type 1, ranks fairly well on government effectiveness, also on regulatory quality. Corruption is above the threshold in any case, and also the corruption perception index is in an intermediate position on this scale. Conversely, again, let's take Turkmenistan. Government effectiveness is very low, regulatory quality even lower, corruption is very high, and there are no available data, at least for that year, from the corruption perception index. So again, this type fares very badly on all these governance dimensions. And if you want to take Russia once more, here government effectiveness is below the threshold, not as bad as in Turkmenistan, but nevertheless, same for regulatory quality. Corruption is, well, not as bad as in Turkmenistan, but nevertheless, the CPI is also fairly low.
Turkmenistan is doing better, actually. They have internet now, Turkmenistan.
Well, but I don't know the present scores. I mean, these data are 2 or 3 years old, you know. But anyway, and these are all regularly collected indicators. So, and they are chosen here because they are practically, except for the BTI, which he was talking about, which I did not want to include here, are the only ones available on a longitudinal basis. Freedom House since the early 1970s. The GER data even go back to the early 19th century as a Van Hanen data, because in retrospect you can, using the constitutions as with GER or using electoral data as with Van Hanen, you can go back in history. For other subjective assessments like Freedom House, it's difficult to go back in history to see what the freedom of opinion was in the Soviet Union in 1921 or any other year, you see. So these three major indicators, Farnham and Göre and Freedom House, have been the most widely used, and the BTI only now has been done twice, I believe, 2003 and 2006, so it's much more recent, and so no long-term data are available as yet for this particular measure. But if we then now see what is the system-specific side of such scores, it can be shown that there are significant, highly significant differences by system type, even though the overall number of cases, 27, is not so high, but the significance nevertheless is high. Here, for example, you can show that the 11 democracies, these type 1 countries, have a mean of 0.47 on government effectiveness, and even if you take the standard deviation going back at below and above this score, it's still clearly different from the score by the authoritarian systems, which are very low on this, and also clearly lower than the intermediate type of electoral democracies. And the same, more or less, is true for the regulatory quality. The democracies fare best, the authoritarian systems worst, and the other ones are in between again, and similarly for corruption and similar measures. So the kind of information you can draw from such a table is that on average for this region and for that time span, democracies are better governed. And when we also look at some other, at a later stage performance criteria, we can also show that they perform better because there is this relationship between democracy on the whole and better governance. And if there are some cases like Singapore you mentioned before, which is in a World Bank sense, also I don't have the scores here, but I think it would apply, is better governed, being not democratic, and they have the rule of law to some extent, but it does not mean that all individual cases must conform to that broader system type, but among the authoritarian systems, I would argue Singapore is rather the exception than the rule. And if you talk about development economics and other approaches, most of the so-called development dictatorships turned out to be dictatorships, but without development. And so, in this respect, it can be shown looking at other regions, and I did it with data for Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Asian countries.
We have also the case of South Korea and Taiwan, which democratized after a rapid economic development.
Yeah. There we come to the question, but we can come to this a bit later maybe, what are the factors behind democratization? And in my view, but we can argue about this, there are several paths, several ways to democracy. Some start early on, even under poor socioeconomic conditions like India and quite a number of other cases. Others only at a later stage, after having passed through an authoritarian regime, but which was not, at least for a while, which was better governed, and only towards the end showed clearer signs of corruption and rigidity in the system. And then in the meantime, the middle classes have been growing and discontent has been growing. And so eventually, towards the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, South Korea and Taiwan, which is a similar case, then democratized, but in a different way, in a different path, historically speaking. And you have some other paths which you can distinguish for other parts of the world. So, in this respect, democracies do relatively well. And one partial explanation, not a full explanation, but a partial explanation for such performance criteria. And maybe I go first to the next one, to the human development indicators. This is also more directly performance related. And then you can show, and UNDP uses three major sub-indicators to compose a human development index. One is GDP per capita, measured in purchasing power parities. Any idea what purchasing power parities are? Pardon?
The index that allows to identify the purchasing power in different countries and compare them. So you can say that you take some product basket or something like this and compare the power of purchasing power of people in different countries. So it's like.
But you need to buy a certain amount of products.
Well, usually if you want to do it properly, and even there are practical problems, you have to have a kind of a basket of consumer goods which is comparable, and some of these baskets are not really comparable because, I mean, some people prefer potatoes, some others eat noodles or rice and things like that. But nevertheless, you can come up, but it is important that, for example, fluctuations in exchange rates do not affect this indicator. The dollar now being rather low does not mean that the economy of the United States has declined by 25% or so. It's just the exchange rate which has fluctuated. And also internal inflation rates do affect GDP per capita measures if they are not adjusted according to purchasing power parities. And for example, you have a very simple indicator in The Economist, the weekly British magazine. Any idea what they use as an indicator for purchasing power parities? It's a famous Big Mac index because it's an identical product, the same ingredients everywhere in the world, the same amount of labor going into this product, the same technology, everything is same. And then they can compare the Big Mac here in Russia compared to the Big Mac in Germany or Britain or anywhere in the world, and they have a rough indication for a certain kind of consumer goods which can be compared in this way. So it's much better than what the World Bank still uses or usually does. They only look at GDP per capita and do not adjust for purchasing power parity. So UNDP in this respect is a better source, more meaningful source. And second separate indicator is life expectancy, which is also a kind of an umbrella concept because it means it reflects, for example, the situation of nutrition in a country or the health situation and level of infectious diseases and other things. So it's a kind of a compound measure for a number of things lying behind this in terms of, again, possible factors related to governance and democracy. And literacy is another important measure, even though for this region, for historical reasons, literacy does not differentiate as much as, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa or even Latin America or some other parts of the world. And if you look at these three indicators, which are combined with this HDI, Human Development Index, you have, first of all, again here just to see how they have been classified, the system types, then GDP in purchasing power parities, Czech Republic having a high score, 14,700, Hungary 12,300, Turkmenistan or Tajikistan 1,170, Russia, again 2 or 3 years ago, 7,100. Life expectancy in Czech Republic 75, in I don't know anyway, Tajikistan 68, Russia only 66.6. Literacy is generally quite high, with some certain exception of Albania with 85, and the others are all fairly high. But for specific historical reasons under Soviet regimes, literacy was almost universal. And the HDI combines these three indicators, and it does it in an additive way, taking the mean of all these three indicators after they have been standardized, and then you have, the highest value is 1, the lowest is 0, and for the Czech Republic, to take this example again, you have 0.861, which is among the highest. For here, Tajikistan, you have 0.67, which is for this region very low, and you have Russia, which is somewhere in between, 0.779. And so you have these measures which are, in a certain sense, also quote-unquote objective measures, because they measure the quality of life. That's what it's called by UNDP, the social conditions, if you wish, in each country, according to income, to life expectancy, which includes health and other aspects, and literacy. And so, again, some important distinctions become visible. And if you look at the performance on these scores per system type, you again can show that for GDP, quite clearly, the democracies have the highest scores, but also for life expectancy, literacy, the differences are not that big, but nevertheless, they are not significant, but there are some differences here. And conversely, again, the authoritarian systems have the lowest score here, lowest life expectancy, and also literacy is not very much differentiated. So these are the major scores. And if you want to, I go back to the other one first, see what kind of partial reasons or causal mechanisms may lie behind such scores. On the one hand, you had better governance for democracies, but on the other hand, you also have different budget priorities. Again, if you look at the different countries here, the amount spent on health and education on the one hand, and on defense and the military on the other. And if you take the Czech Republic, here you have a value of 6.6% of GDP, which is fairly high, and 4% on education, and only 2.1% on the military. And if you take Russia, 3.8% on defense, 3.7% on health, and 4% on education. And again, across the board, you can show such systemic differences, and it shows by these is shown by these budget priorities, and again by system type. You have all the democracies have the highest health expenditure, also the highest education expenditure, and the lowest defense expenditure. And for defense, the intermediate type has the highest value, and the authoritarian are somewhat less. But there are some interesting differences which can show up if you just compare and make use of these available indicators. And so let's go back again. So these are some of the partial explanations which lie behind the better performance of these types. Democracies on the whole, one can say, are better governed, and they spend their money in different ways, which leads to a better performance in such important sectors like healthcare and education, at least in terms of the amounts spent, but also in terms of, real life indicators like well, life expectancy and similar things. Yeah.
Simply looking at the figures, what makes you certain that it's a question of causation and not only of correlation?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's just a hint or an indication that there may be such a relationship. It does not pretend and does not aim at explaining the entire performance of such countries. Then the endowment by natural resources, trade relations, many other factors would come into play. So it's only very, I said, a partial explanation, or maybe I should have said just a partial indication of how they perform. But nevertheless, I've done similar studies on different regions in the world, and the same relationships did show up. So at least it's some indication of that there is some, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but that there is some correlation, and you can at least test the causal error in these relationships by lagging such data to see whether the democracies perform better after the early 90s than before on such scales. And if you do it in different parts of the world, you can show that democratization, at least for a number of the more stable democracies which emerged, also led to a higher performance on such governance and social indicators. So there is some relatively sound and robust information that there is this causal link. Yeah.
So the causation you draw out of the historical dimension, if you look at different figures from different times.
The error of causality is determined by chronological order, so to speak. Yeah.
Sorry, what about the United States, the figures for the United States? I think maybe this very well fits perfectly with the European welfare state social system, but maybe it does not that much correlate to the United States. Or I just have a hint, not a question. I'm not sure.
Well, I don't have the figures right here, but in other analyses, all the OECD countries are included as well, and you can see some considerable differences. And for example, on the democracy scores, with some more demanding indicators, you can show that, for example, Berlusconi's Italy was not so terribly democratic because, I mean, there was almost a media monopoly, both controlling most of the private electronic media, plus, while he was Prime Minister, controlling to some extent the public media. And so other negative scores can be shown even for well-established democracies, if you do it in a more differentiated way. And for example, performance indicators, and that's why I said it's not just the budget you should look at. In the United States, you have the highest percentage of GNP spent for health, but at the same time, you have the most expensive health system in the world, which only covers, and that's the dark side of it, only 80 to 85% of the population. And 10 to 15% are without public health care or significant other kinds of health care. And so even though it's highly expensive, a lot of money spent, it does not necessarily mean that you have the healthiest population in the world, or that all parts of the population are equally well covered. And that's why I looked at a further dimension, which shows the degree of social inequality, which to some extent shows some of the internal tensions which may exist in societies, but also things like income distribution, for example, which are sort of averaged out if you just look at the GNP per capita, even by purchasing power parities, because these are just mean values for entire countries, and they do not reflect the distribution within these countries. And so if you take some indicators here, what the World Bank calls a political stability index, which in fact, if you look at it in closer detail, is an index, well, the indicators entering into it is an index of political instability. So you must be careful as to the direction. Secondly, I used the Gini index, which is an indicator of income distribution, which is more commonly known and used and employed by collected by the World Bank. And I used a third indicator here, which by Tato van Haren is used for a different purpose, but nevertheless he has what he calls an index of power resources, and how these power resources are distributed in different societies. And he has 3 factors as parts of this composite index of power resources. On the one hand, he has what he calls index of occupational differentiation, which refers to the kind of, well, division of labor in society, whether it's a highly developed society in terms of a high level of division of labor. Secondly, he uses index of knowledge distribution, the percentage of the population in different stages of the educational system, primary school, secondary school, universities. And as a third measure, he looks at the rural structure, how in agriculture the structure looks like, and this is particularly important for regions like, for example, Latin America, but also some other of the developing regions of the world. And then he looks at the index whether, at the fact whether the rural population is largely engaged in family farming. So there are small peasants or farmers, family-based farming, or whether there is a huge discrepancy between, like in many Latin American countries, between huge latifundios and minifundios, and so you have this kind of quasi-feudalistic pattern. And his argument is, if you have more family farming and if agriculture is still is an important part of the economy, it's more equal in terms of social conditions, and also if the other 2 indices, higher division of labor, higher knowledge resources, tends to equalize society. So it's a different kind of measure which you can use to see what is the social inequality like. And if we come to now this table, again by country, you see, and here the data are less complete, and the Gini data, generally speaking, worldwide, are on the one hand amongst the most incomplete, and also at the same time, which is a pity, but it's the case, and you must be aware of this, are amongst the most unreliable. So there are not really good income distribution statistics for many countries in the world, and so you have to take it with a big grain of salt. But nevertheless, if you look at, well, here Czech Republic, to use the same example, it's quite high on political stability. The Gini index is very low. It has to be said, Gini ranks between 0 and 100, and the higher you are on the Gini index, the more unequal your society is. Any idea how this index is arrived at?
10% of the, or 20% of the richest people.
Well, you can subdivide it in quartiles and things like that, but generally speaking, well, very simply, I don't have it here, but just to demonstrate, you have 2 scales. One is the level of income, and one is the number of the population. And if you have a diagonal, this is a line of absolute equality. And the index then measures the space between this diagonal and this curve of the index, of the Gini index. And so the space in between the diagonal and this curve is an area, and it's a 2-dimensional area, and it's then measured by this Gini index. But again, we have to be careful. For example, if you have a developing country with still a high share of subsistence agriculture, then you would have, at the low side, you would have almost total equality because all people live in equal misery, so to speak. But then you would have a big bulge here, and a country like India, for example, is still to some extent in this category. You cannot differentiate very much in the subsistence sector, but for the upper part, the inequality is very high. And so it can be misleading to, if the overall score of India on the Gini index is an intermediate one, it does not show the real discrepancies between the very rich and the large part of the quite poor. And so you have to be careful with such indices, but nevertheless you can show, well, Czech Republic fares well. Let's look at Russia again. It's somewhere in the middle, I believe. Here, political stability, it's closer to the zero. Gini is quite high, among the highest, the highest here. And index of resource distribution is also fairly low. So Russia, apparently, and you know it much better, has some problems in this respect. And if you look in the streets, the kinds of cars driven by some people, I think do indicate some strong discrepancies in certain regards. So, and again, this can be shown by system time, and the democracies, even with all the necessary caveats and qualifications as far as the reliability and validity of these data are concerned, the democracies again have the best scores by far, also on the Gini index, and the highest score on the index of power resources. So, as some preliminary conclusions, these current most often used indicators can be employed to at least get some regular information on the performance, on the one hand, of individual countries, but also with regard to certain major political system types. And so in this sense, there is some information which seems valid, and if you combine it in a certain way, and which, I mean, spares you the effort as the BDI does to try to do it afresh. But the BDI is of course much more ambitious, as this is just a very limited use of available measures. The distinctions, which are broad and rough, but nevertheless between liberal democracies, electoral democracies, and authoritarian states do differentiate meaningfully in terms of governance and performance of these systems. And at least for these data and for the region and the time period, the liberal democracies clearly fared best on almost all of these indicators, and the authoritarian states worst. And one, as I said again, partial explanation or partial indication lies in the respective budgetary allocations, but also in part as far as some of the governance characteristics, lower corruption, and in this sense less waste of resources and other things are concerned. And finally, but it's not the complete picture as far as the performance is concerned. You do have to look at the geopolitical situation, economic resources, cultural background, international influences. If you want to really go into the performance and development aspect in greater detail, but even with this limited kind of information, I would say that it at least gives you some important hints where things are going, and so this shows that political science with limited means and all the conceptual and other problems and weaknesses can come up with some simple but meaningful analyses which are not, well, only useful for the academic world, but which do have practical and political implications, and you have to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of such measures in order to be able to judge them, but also if people use them in a misleading way or in a way which would not be justified by the quality of the sources and the measures taken, you must be careful. And just as one small remark, for example, the Van Halen index, which we talked about before, often is, in my view, and I think in Tatus view himself, mistaken to be taken as an indicator of the quality of democracy. It's only, in my view, an indicator. Those above the threshold, he terms democracies, below the threshold are not democracies, but it does not mean whether a country has a score of 20 or 30 or 40 on this scale, that it's a better democracy, either in a normative or in a functional sense. And many people, for example, argue that Italy or Israel or the Netherlands have relatively high values on Van Halen's democracy scale in the 40s, but it's because the party systems are highly fragmented, and in the Italian parliament, Israel, and Dutch parliament, you have many parties, and this higher degree of fragmentation even can be an impediment to good governance. As you see in Belgium right now, they have tried for half a year to form a government, and they did not arrive at one yet, and you cannot say because on the Van Halen index, Belgium scores relatively high, it's a better democracy. On the contrary, in the case of Italy also shows this, it may be a worse democracy. So it's important to be aware what these indicators actually mean and what they don't mean, and that you do not misuse them or use them for purposes which are not really justified. Okay, that's all. Thank you. Yeah, any questions, please?
Are the tables available in internet? The tables?
Well, these are just my own compilations, but I can... no copyright. You can have them. I mean, all the data sources are publicly available. UNDP, Freedom House, Van Halen has a website. All these indicators are publicly accessible. I only put them together in a certain way and interpreted it in a certain way. But you can have my slides if you want. This is no problem. I have a stick and you can copy it if you... I can... Well, if you send me an email, I can mail it to you, no problem. And I can give you my email address or my card if you wish. There's the address on it.
Thank you very much.
So,
Could you just tell your email address, please?
pardon?
Could you tell your email address?
It's,
You can print it.
I can write it
Visible.
more
Make it
even.
visible.
Okay, well I have to, just a second. All right, here, and, well I could even write it on here, can't I?
You can put it to an armchair.
Well, just, no I can't. So I have to go into Word, I guess. Huh? Word, Microsoft Word. Okay, so it's... Oh, sorry. It's Cyrillic. But it's simple. It's like my last name, Bergschl, without the hyphen, and there's the last, so it's just 8 letters. B-E-R-G, S-C-H-L, and then at, and then it's staff, S-T-A-F-F.
You're welcome with English.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Buchstabieren Sie bitte.
Okay. B-E-R-G, and I have to look where the hyphen is here. No, it's without the hyphen, sorry. Virtual, okay. And at is up here, is it? No, it's not. It's this one?
Shift.
No. It's shift and 2. Okay, at. Oh, sorry, the first letter should be
Small one.
small one. Yes. A small initial. At staff. Dot. Then there's a keyboard. It should be a dot. Staff. Dot. And then uni. Now I need a hyphen. Uni hyphen. Hyphen Marburg. Oh, with one A, of course, yes. Have to go. Burg and dot again, DE. So, let's do some DE for Germany, Deutschland. So, virtual, small, initial, staff.uni, hyphen, marburg.de. All right. No. Okay, I'll give you mine.
Now your server will be dealt with the flow of emails from Russia requiring for
Not so many.
information, data, slides, whatever.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I have a question about marketing, which is model.
Yeah.
There are some countries where not only parties participating, but also coalitions of parties. And does he measure coalitions in this case, or
Well,
parties?
he only measures parties in parliament. So if some parties are excluded by a 5% or 7% clause, they are not listed.
Yeah.
Only party representation in parliament.
I mean, for example, in Italy,
Yeah.
there are two major coalitions of parties.
Yes.
And they participate in the
Yeah,
elections.
but he measures the individual parties.
Just in the
Just the individual parties. That's why they have such a high score.
Там произошло смещение, смотреть, там это было особенно новый вариант, то есть
Это его сейчас на пятницу принесли?
по-моему, да, вот у нас в структуре проверка регионалистов, которые, знаете, там вроде обновленно вывешивали списки, а проверившие повесили новые, если это было. Либо вот спросите историю, даже не те, что они вот сдвинули сзади. Я не знаю, что первую Кристина, да, медиа политики. Ну, да, я поняла, вот есть
Хорошо, если вы запись говорите, наверное, по-умному.